Hello everybody, and welcome to this month's Specifying Practice Group call. So with that, I do want to hand it over to our co-chairs, David Stutzman and Louis Medcalf, to do any introductions of the topics, recap anything from last month, before we hand off today's guest speaker, Ujjwal Vyas, who will be talking on today's topic in more detail. So David and Louis, over to you, and we'll get going with today's session.
Well, thank you very much, Matt, and thanks for getting me into the meeting correctly. At least I can join. I'm joining everybody today from Eastern Shore Community College at the southern end of the Eastern Shore of Maryland on my way to the CSI Region Conference, pulled over in the visitor parking lot. So, Louis.
Yes.
I'm guessing that you're still in Nashville.
I am. We're having a kind of a little bit of a rainy day here, but comfortably mild. So
well, good.
We want to remind folks that you can participate in Twitter with the hashtag CSISPG, and that might be fun.
Yeah, I see a few folks. My notices are popping up. Since I'm remote, I'm seeing them on my iPad here. But we have a real treat for everyone today, and I know that some of you that are online with us may have been at the CSI Academies and had a chance to listen to the keynote speaker at the Academies. It's Ujjwal Vyas, an attorney from Chicago. And he's been involved with CSI through the owner's task team, trying to, I guess, impress upon everyone, especially owners, the importance of specifications and specifiers. So I think we're in for a real treat today.
Of course, he's preaching to the choir. We all think that we're pretty important folks, even if nobody else does.
But maybe he has some ideas how we can make that impression even better.
Sell ourselves as being indispensable.
Yes, that's right. Okay, so Ujjwal, I hope you're on here with us.
I am. I just didn't want to interrupt while you guys were doing your preambles. Boy, I feel so technically capable suddenly.
So Ujjwal, just to let you know, too, we have a really nice crowd here looking at the attendee list. And a pretty broad spectrum of folks. Specifiers, I see a good number on here. Even specifiers, which is even better. So I'm hoping you can make a really good impression here today. So have at it.
Not too much pressure or anything.
I was just going to say that, the pressure just keeps mounting, my gosh. As some of you know, my name is Ujjwal Vyas, and I'm really pleased to do this. This is very, very interesting. I've been involved in CSI for quite some time now, and one of the things that I've been tasked with in two different ways. One, with the owner's task team, is, as David suggested, to really reach out to owners and to other entities in the construction industry to begin to get them to realize who specifiers are, what specifications are about, and the key value propositions that are involved there. The other part is that I have been working for quite some time, probably a year now, on a project for CSI National to deal with specifically trying to understand the risk management value propositions to owners and to other parties for the CSI itself, for certified specifiers, and for specifications in general. Those two things have sort of combined over the course of the last year or a year and a half of thinking that I've been working on here. And the outcome of that has been to think very, very carefully about the future of specifications and the business scenarios that are necessary for success going forward. Now, most of us know, and there's been a lot of consternation about what the future of specifications looks like. Obviously, there's all kinds of other entities that are migrating into this area who are more than happy to take over chunks of what it is that specifiers traditionally did. On the other hand, what specifiers traditionally did are starting to grow into other areas which are difficult to control. And as a lot of us have been talking about, even the term specifier or specifications is becoming kind of limiting. in terms of what we want to communicate to the rest of the audience for construction. And one of the things that I want to try to do here is really talk very, very straightforwardly about the first half of the talk is going to be about what we really need to be thinking about, and the second half of the talk is going to be who we need to be thinking about this for. And I know that's a slightly obscure way to say it, but I hope that the talk will explain that. So let me just talk just a minute about the title. So understanding and delivering the value proposition of specification services to owners. So most of the people in this talk, of course, as Louis has already said, in a way I'm talking to the converted. But I think what I have to say by the end of this talk you'll see is an unusual and I think very productive way to think about how to make the case much more powerful. Now, obviously many of you understand specification services, but what I'm really concerned about is how you deliver the value proposition to owners. And I'm going to talk very specifically about why that's so important to the future of specification. So I'm going to give you the standard definition, which we all talk about or are sort of familiar with. I've condensed it. I'm sure there might be things I could add or delete, depending on personal preferences. But let me just read it. So,
yeah,
go ahead.
You know, kind of as we evolve in this industry and in our profession and our little niche in the profession, we really need to think of ourselves as being information managers.
Yep. Give me 2 slides and I'll get there. Just give me a couple of slides. So, but I appreciate exactly what you're saying, because I know that when I first started interacting with CSI, that was one of the first and long conversations I had, was that my analogy was to chief information officers. That many, many years ago, the people who did the IT in various types of organizations were thought to be the people stuck in a closet somewhere, or the people who always wore mismatched socks or something like that and had to be kept hidden. And now they have a seat at the boardroom because the core information, the relevancy of that information to the success of the company is so crucial and has grown to such a degree that they're a vital part. And I see that as a proper analogy for what the future of specifications can be like. So being an information manager, to me, it's sort of like becoming the chief information manager for the whole construction project. All right. So let me just, you guys have all read this definition already, but I'll just say it because I want to say a few words about it. So Specifier creates written documentation for material systems and assemblies in a building, providing a basis for bidding and construction. And that last part is very important. When you're going to talk about the value proposition, it is providing the basis for bidding and construction, which is crucial. That's what this is all about. But I'm going to give you what I think is a slightly better definition. I think this will be appropriate for you, Louis.
Very good.
A specifier is a building information manager. For those of you listening, apart from Louis and I, we didn't set this up before it began. But a specifier is a building information manager who translates the assertions of design into the reality of the building. And let me say 2 or 3 words about this, because I think this is very, very crucial. We can agree that building information management is the future. We don't mean it by this just BIM. We mean that as I talked about with IT, the amount of information that is flowing is so large and needs to be managed continuously to make the project succeed that somebody has to take control over it and understand the proper protocols, et cetera, that need to be done. But I think even more important in this definition, which I see as the core of this definition, is the word translate. I see the specifier, the specifying professional, the building information managing professional, whatever we want to call this. This is the individual who translates between design and reality. And as any good translator, you've got to know both languages well. And this is really the beginning of the powerful proposition, value proposition, that the world of specifications and specifiers can bring to the table. To the degree that they know both languages, they can really provide significantly greater value to the ultimate client. So, how do they do this? the specifier turns the necessary blizzard of information, and I say this very directly, it's a necessary blizzard. You can't escape the blizzard of information now, because that's just what what reality is. Between design and construction now, into relevant information by exercising judgment. So let's remember, lots of people go on and on about big data and information and all this. There's a big difference between information and relevant information. And the way in which you're able to separate the two requires two things. Exercising judgment, yes, but the only way you can exercise judgment is you must have skepticism. Judgment without skepticism doesn't exist. This is the most important set of attributes that specifiers bring to the table. They are skeptical about whether it's a product, whether it's a design, whether it's a process, because they know that in the end, when the rubber meets the road, they're going to have to make it work. And so they have to exercise their judgment to extract the relevant information so that the ultimate translation can take place between the design and the ultimate product, which is the built asset. Now, when you start to think about it this way, you realize, I would argue, that the role of the specifier can, in many cases, be significantly more important to an owner than the role of the architect. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go forward, but that'll depend on a particular project.
Ujjwal, Dave Metzger raises the issue that the definition could equally apply to a project architect. Design concept seems more understandable than design assertion, but as you note, since we're being skeptical, he says. And of course, the difference is the average architect who winds up doing drafting is not capable of signing his name legibly, much less writing a coherent English paragraph.
Well, and here, I'm sympathetic with what you've just said, Louis. One of the issues is that, yes, at certain dreamland, architects are capable of doing all these things. But the way architects are generally trained and the way they're validated and valorized for what they can do, they're valorized for design. And I mean, this would be a different kind of talk if we were going to really get into the inner details of how we discuss design, what we discuss about aesthetics. I mean, it's interesting because I know that David introduced me as an attorney, but I did do some other things before I was an attorney, and I was a construction attorney for well over a decade, but I used to be a professor at architecture schools before that. And I taught history and theory of architecture, and I taught graduate design studios. So I have some really deep familiarity with the assumptions and sociology of architectural practice and architectural thinking. And one of the oddities is that it would be great if project architects really knew how to translate between design and the ultimate built asset. So when you look at the AIA documents and you look at the way in which certain types of preferences are given to design over anything else, it becomes a problem. And I'm more than willing to talk about that. I've talked about it many times. I've published on it and so forth. And I have a relatively aggressive view about this that I'm willing to defend. But let me see if I can get through just a few more slides. Not that I love talking. Many of the people who know me already know this, and I'm happy to do that. But I would feel remiss if I felt like I didn't get us a little bit closer to the business issues and then really begin the conversation. So, what is the value? Meaning, let's go back a little bit. Okay. So, what is the specifier trying to do? He's turning this blizzard of information, making it relevant information, exercising judgment, translating between these two things. What's the value of doing this? Essentially, and this is a concept from economics, you don't have to pursue it in any greater detail, but if anybody has greater interest, I'm happy to talk to them about it. What you're doing is you're essentially decreasing transaction costs of the project. And the way in which you want to think about transaction costs is transaction costs are frictional costs. And so if you're able to decrease those frictional costs, you're able to increase the efficiency of the overall project. So there are three clear ways in which you do this, and they're linked to the three fundamental sort of attributes of economics. Cost, which is about resources. So I'm just giving one example of what the current specifier does, is by having a really good product in specifications, you're able to get true estimates in bidding. When you do that, you provide significant benefits in controlling the overall cost of the project and the baseline cost of the project. The second great important thing in economics is, of course, time. And so what you're really dealing with here, obviously many of you know this already, decreased RFIs, change orders. This is very, very important, and many people don't realize how crucial it is that specifications can have an impact on that. And then the third thing, which is the most important thing that we've talked about, information management. But what's the value of that information? The real value of this information is that you are able to, by making it coherent and providing a coherent translation from design into the bidding and into the construction, you decrease the risk for dispute. Now, most people don't think of this carefully in my mind, and maybe it's just because of my training, but the cost of dispute can often overwhelm the cost of everything else. So a major value proposition for specifiers is their capacity, by producing a good, coherent product, to be able to decrease the overall cost for dispute on the project. And this can be disputes for cost, disputes for time, schedule delays, as well as other types of disputes that could be Division 1, other types of legal or other types of situations, which are the result of information failure. Right? So that's the current way to think about this.
And Ujwal, just one more point, because you talked about time, but the time you were listing was only for items that were happening essentially during bidding and construction. And you and I discussed a little while ago about an issue where we had the failure of documents, because they were not very good, actually delaying the project during agency approval, which can extend the time of the project extensively, and has the potential of losing financing as a result of it.
David, you're absolutely right, and one of the things that I tried to do in this talk is that I tend to be one of those people who relies on PowerPoint, that I put like 18 bullet points on that PowerPoint and try to go through it all. and so I said, listen, I've got to try, and this is just, it's purely a formal thing. What I'm trying to suggest is there are many places for time, there are many places for cost, and I was just giving one example as a way to move that forward. But we'll revisit that again in just a second, so we can talk more deeply about this. What I really think has to happen is that what you suggested right there, what I've suggested, and there are probably 50 other suggestions going on in the minds of people who are attending this right now. Those issues, that cost, that time benefit, and that information benefit is something that has to be brought to the fore. It's crucial as an attribute for what specifiers or building information managers are going to do. And then they have to learn, and this is what I'm going to be talking about in just a second, how can that actually be done? What has to be taken care of? Right? So that's my real question. When we talk about all this value, right, the value isn't for other specifiers. Value actually isn't even for architects generally. Right? Specifiers currently define their value in relationship to the architect. And this is the result of traditional momentum, the sociology of what took place, the history of the relationship between CSI and AIA, and the two professions, and the overlap of those professions. Great. But I would argue to you very strongly that this has its limitations. So the current model, as many of you know, it's the owner-architect, and then there's a specifier underneath there, which we know commonly. But the most important thing here is it's black line. And what that means is that the specifier never has access to anything above that black line. That is the owner primarily. Okay? They're subservient to the architect in many of these relationships. And let me give you a quantitative example of this. And maybe I want to explain a little bit before we go forward, but one of the major attributes of this work that I've been doing for the last year has been the creation and the dissemination of a detailed survey which was produced with the help of a biostatistician to really try to understand some of the basic issues for specifiers and this market. So on the top, I give you what are the common, typical contract expectations derived from AIA or other types of bases, where you basically say it's somewhere between 20 to 25 to 35% of the total fees for a project are going to be dedicated to plans and specs, drawings and specifications. So here I just split it into two. Now you see the results from the bottom for a very high N value of 448 respondents. And many of you may have responded to the survey. These are the results of that, and when I complete this report, which should be done by the end of this month probably, the full report will be released, and the survey will be released, which I think, frankly, would be a very interesting topic just to go through the survey itself for specifiers to see what the results were. But here's one of the most important results. The survey shows that 60% of firms spend just under 30% of total fee on drawings, but they spend less than 5% of total fee on specifications. And an extraordinary part of that 60% spent less than 1% of total fee on specifications. Now, this is very striking to me, for two reasons. One is, of course, that it's represented in the documents as though you will spend something like 12 to 15%, maybe 10% at the low end, to do specifications. But in general, less than half of that, and often less than a tenth of that, less than 1% is being spent on specifications. This indicates what I think most of you already know, that all too often you're brought in at the last minute to do something that should take you a week in a day. And me, I'm just thinking about myself, no matter how competent, capable, dedicated I am, there are only so many hours in a day. I can't do 60 hours worth of work in 16 hours. And so this has a fundamental relationship to the quality of the documents that are sent downstream. And I can tell you, Casey Robb referenced this at CSI Academies, but I've seen it in other studies as well. The quality of documents has been systemically decreasing in the construction industry for quite some time, both plans and specifications. And this has to do with a whole series of things. Compression of fees is often claimed to be a problem, but especially when you find out that many people are doing less than 1% of fee on specifications, something else is going on there. And what's going on there is that architecture firms prefer to eat up specifications fee and keep designing for as long as possible, because design is the most important thing for them.
Ujjwal, I have a question about that issue. From drawing on your experience as a construction lawyer, is it not the case that most judges and juries and even attorneys think that architects and engineers spend essentially the same amount of time or effort or energy on specifications as they do on drawings?
Yes. This was very striking to me, because one of the things that I would say, I don't practice anymore, but one of the things that I would say is that if you're spending 1% and you've represented that you are essentially going to be spending 15%, you're negligent per se. Right? If something goes wrong, what you've done is you've made HR decisions to systemically cause the potential for errors downstream and are negligent. Right here, let's be clear about this legally here. You could certainly be said to have breached your contract. And the breach of that contract, and the way these professional liability things work, breach of the contract often implies that you've acted negligently in this kind of case. So if you're telling me, and I say this to different types of crowds, that you have a $50 million building, and what you did was spend less than 1% on the specifications, knowing that specifications are a legal document which are going to have significant implications downstream for all bidding and construction, and will be held by the court, by various types of statutory and other interpretive regimes, to be necessary and effective to fulfill the construction. Plaintiffs' attorneys haven't figured this out yet, but if plaintiffs' attorneys had figured this out, you would have firms in serious trouble. As you well know, one of the other things that came out of the survey is you have plenty of time when the ratio of specifier to non-administrative personnel in a firm is 100 to 1.
Ushval, Brian Payne asks, where is it implied in the AIA documents what percentage of effort is going to be spent on specifications?
What you do often is that you put in a schedule of fees, and you say, I'm going to spend X amount in my preliminary work. I'm going to spend X amount in doing, the construction.
Right, schematic design development, CDs.
And so and this can often be in a letter as well. You're saying, okay, we're going to estimate that we're going to take this much of the fee for this, that, or the other. So usually what happens is it puts plans and specifications are put together and some number is put in there. So the assumption is that you're essentially splitting them equally.
Or certainly that they are of equal importance in terms of the that there's a commensurate amount of effort and energy put into them.
Exactly. And if you're not going to mean that, right, which is, no. Really what we're going to do is we're going to spend 1% on specifications and we're going to spend 29% on drawings, one would expect that to be affirmatively differentiated.
Incidentally, Ushval, when I was writing specifications for my previous two firms, the project managers would always, of course, try to hammer me down on the number of hours, and then my response would say, how many hours is it going to take to write specs? And I finally figured out that instead of saying how many hours, I'd say, 2.5 sheets.
Yes.
2.5 drawing sheets, or 3 drawing sheets.
Yeah. And this is exactly the problem, which is that there are internal business issues that have to be solved, and as we go forward here, we'll see that I'm very optimistic. I started out this project not being optimistic, frankly. I was quite pessimistic because I thought that, we were getting to sort of the twilight of the world of specifications. But the more I looked into this and the more I thought about a certain type of business solution, I'm very optimistic that the position of the building information manager that grows out of specifiers who are providing this kind of meaningful service has a robust future. But we just need to make a few, I think, crucial business changes. So this particular slide just sort of says, what does the current model, what are some of the core problems of the current model? We have mismatched incentives between the designer and the specifier. Just what you talked about here, Lois, and just what we're wrestling with, which is if you're going to spend that much time on the drawings and the design and the schematics and all of that, why are we only spending 1% for these actual core contract documents? And those contract documents...
I think you hit on one of the items earlier today, and this morning I was presenting to a university class in Philadelphia, and we were talking about specifications in general and as an introduction to what the specs are about. We were going through the process and the workflow through the design, and I asked the class, when does design stop? And more than one student responded very quickly, never. So I think that goes to explaining some of the the relative importance that the firms are placing on drawings as compared to the specifications.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is commonly understood is the way in which people are rewarded in architecture firms. They're rewarded for being on the design track. And so design becomes very, very important, high prestige. This is a whole sociological problem in architecture that they're trying to decide, I think, really at this moment, whether they really are primarily about design, which is not professional, not with a capital P. A lot of the stuff that gets done doesn't require you to be licensed, because that type of design is not really structured to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public, really. We can have a longer conversation about that, and I'm happy to do that. But when you have the disproportionate importance given to design, then it becomes difficult to understand, one, why this isn't simply revealed to the client, right? And then secondly, on what what basis does this sort of significantly disproportionate reality exist? I have many views about this, and I always feel badly because I could talk for hours about it, but the mismatch creates ultimately an impossibility for the specifier and the specifying services to ever be given the value that they should have. And I'm going to explain a little bit about that as well. One of the key things, of course, is specifiers have no control. I mean, I don't know how many specifiers that can go up to the design principal and say, hey, look, you've only allotted, 3% to me. You got to stop that. Give me 12.
That would work, wouldn't it, Louis?
Not in my experience.
Well, and so that's an important thing, is when you lack this level of control. Go ahead.
But one of the important things, and I'm sure you're going to touch on it as you go forward, is the concept that the specifier needs to be involved from basically day one.
Absolutely. The proper seat at the table can't be acquired if nobody takes it seriously.
Not just a necessary evil that has to be done at the week before the project goes out.
Well, I return to the two IT guys in the closet who were thought to be a necessary evil.
Well, see, that used to be when I started in this business. I got my first job in an architect's office in June of 1966. You can do the math yourself. The specifier was this funny little guy at the end of the hall. And they would take the drawings into him 2 weeks before it went out, and he'd sit there and write the specs.
Yeah, it was a weird black box character. You didn't bring him out.
That's right.
They had a hunchback, or as I always say, you never invited those people to the prom, right? So why would you? They lack control, and they're doing work that has no prestige, ostensibly from the architect's perspective. So they lack control over fee allocation. They lack control over the amount of time they can spend on various types of things. And as you were just pointing out, they lack control over input. Right? They're not there at the beginning, or they're not even there at the relevant times to prevent significant problems. I mean, redesign is a classic problem here. Right? Go ahead.
We have a comment from Kevin O'Byrne, who says, if we assume that the specifier is also helping to prepare Division 00, he needs to be, or she needs to be, engaged as soon as design starts. You cannot write specs without knowing which front-end documents are being used, and optimally Division 1 should be significantly advanced before Divisions 2 through 49 specs are started.
Oh, I agree with you. I mean, often the dilemma here is that, design is already plowing far ahead without even thinking about any of these core relationships. But that just happens to be the internal practice of many firms. What I'm going to suggest to you, and once I get a few more slides downstream, is how they can be changed so that the importance of it's not just specifications, it's really you need more and better information now. You can't be depending on copying things out of magazines that look cool from a European perspective as the way in which to permeate design. You really have duties, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And it may seem harsh, but most architects do not comprehend the basis of their duties. They believe that design is something that is the state has given them a monopoly to fulfill their design assertions and use other people's money to do that. Now that's a weird sort of thing. And to me, what specifiers are about is, hey, look, we've got some real stuff to figure out. This is hard stuff. This is difficult. It's dynamic. We need to be really involved so that we can ultimately allow the built asset to not only function properly, but the whole process to proceed in a more efficient manner. So ultimately, one of the mismatched incentives is, to me, specifiers are really about demonstrating value. That's why skepticism has to be there. Judgment is based on demonstrating value, not just guessing for the hell of it. And seeking prestige has become the basis of much architectural practice. Again, we can have a long conversation about it. I hope one day to be able to have a piece at Construct where I just talk about aesthetics and the theory of meaning and how you really think about architecture, but I think that's a long ways away. But I'm happy to talk to anybody about it if they've got the time. So, and the last one, of course, and this is very, very important, the others are crucial, but what I saw as my task is really to double the fee rate of all specifiers. That's what has to happen. Once you double the fee rate, meaning double of what often an architect will make, you will have no problem attracting people to your field.
And everyone who agrees should put your hand up and...
Yeah, right, exactly. So, I mean, when you worry about, well, we can't get young people into our field, young people will go into a field if they know they're going to get paid well and they're going to be respected for what they do. And so now the task is, how do we get to a point in which we get the right value proposition presented to the right people so that they will pay us the right amount? And this is what value is. Okay? Value has to do with an exchange phenomena. Somebody pays you for that value. You have to demonstrate the value, but when you do, they pay you for it. And so it's an exchange. So the real question is, and I would argue, what has happened for specifiers is they're trying to exchange their value with the wrong people, which is architects who systemically think they have no value. Right? So the real people to talk to are owners, or construction managers, whoever else understands the real value of proper information to decrease their risks and to deal with both costs and time issues on the project. And I start out with myself. So, a stupid question, I know it sounds silly, why does an owner build a building? But this often is confused. An owner has a business need and is motivated by economics. Now, in the world of architecture, you don't actually want an owner, you want a patron. Right? You want somebody who's putting up the building because, Uncle Joey left him $1 billion, or he's the CEO of a company and he can spend a bunch of money to, put a grandiose object up to himself, or it's a local school board who doesn't know what they're doing but has a big bond. You're looking for a patron, which will pay you to fulfill personal assertions about design.
Nicholas Pevsner says that great architecture requires two things. One, a great architect, and two, a great client.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and I will follow up with Philip Johnson, who used to say the only way to become an architect is to either be rich or marry rich. And so, and this is not just simply me piling on to architects. This is the internal sociology of architecture has to be recognized, because it's important in terms of how that interacts with what specifiers and the future building information manager looks to actually sell the value proposition. So we have to find the right people to sell it to, and I think it's not the architect, I think it's owners, I think it's design builders, I think it's lots of other people, it's product reps. There are lots of people who understand the core proposition that specifiers can provide, but specifiers, the couple of phrases that I use is that, that they've adopted the prejudices of their masters, i.e. architects, or they've become Stockholm Syndrome survivors. And so we need to really help them. We need to deprogram them so that they can begin to think that their lives outside of the sort of pleasantries or the compliments given by their architectural masters. So in economic terms, the owner wants to minimize transaction costs for the project. This is just outright. It's very plain. This is what you're supposed to do. An owner, and this is an interesting way to think about it in terms of economics, but it's useful. An owner wants to build a building for economic reasons, but he has to make a core decision. It's called the make or buy decision. This is fundamental in all of business firm transaction stuff. But he has to decide, and in fact you do the same thing. Do I want to make my computer or do I want to go and buy it? There are probably some people on this call who are very capable, very bright, and could spend 17 years and make their own computer. Are they going to do that? The answer is no. They're going to go and buy it. So when an owner decides that I don't have the time, I don't have the know-how, and that's the most important thing, builders often do not have the know-how. The owner doesn't have the know-how. They go outside and they get a professional. When they get a professional to do this, it's the professional's duty to service that client's needs, not their own needs. It's a very interesting problem, and I mentioned this at the CSI Academies. I'm just publishing a 50-page paper on these fundamental duties that architects have from first principles. It's never really been worked out before, but it's very, very clear. And the example I will give you is when you go to the doctor, do you take 80 pages of contract documents with you? And the answer is always no. Why? Because you know that the doctor has an affirmative duty to you to protect your interests before his own. Architects have a hard time understanding this problem because they believe, I mean, the state doesn't give a monopoly to doctors so they can practice an art on you. The state gives a monopoly to doctors so that they can use their knowledge and judgment to the aggregate benefit of society by individual relationships with patients. Now, we can talk more about this, but there's it's a very clear and concise and frankly, it's a beautiful layout of the basic principles. And so ultimately, in economic terms, the owner wants to minimize his transaction costs for the project, and he's looking to the architect and other parties to do that for him. Whether they do it or not, that's a separate issue, and we can talk about that. But, so obviously, one of the things that he really wants is a good bidding outcome. If you got crappy documents, people are going to put significant contingency risk costs into the bid. We've talked to numerous people around the country. We've talked to the American Society of Professional Estimators. It's very common that if you're bidding, there will be a 10, even greater percent premium for bad documents. So you can imagine a 10 or 15, and in some cases 20% premium for bad documents means that your lowest bid is not going to be as low as it could be, one. And then two, here's the oddest thing. It's true the architect will never pay for that. The owner is going to pay for that. And the fact that the architect doesn't understand that by creating poor documents and forcing those costs, transferring the costs, those excessive costs onto the owner, is a failure of his own duties, creates a dilemma. That's why when, David, you say you design all the way down, you're thinking, what the heck for? You're really doing this for the owner. You're not doing this for yourself. And so anytime you have somebody putting 1% into the specifications, that's why I say, it's almost per se negligence. Because you know all along that if you're only spending 1% of the fee on specifications, those are going to be crappy documents. That means that things are going to be wrong. And I'll tell you, there are many, many people, including lots of design builders, contractors, and others that we've talked to, who commonly know that the documents are lucky to be 70% complete. So if you're looking at documents that are 70% complete, you're going to put some crazy number on it for contingencies. And ultimately, the owner pays for that. So that's a bad outcome. Time, of course, decreased schedule delays. All of you are familiar with this. This is always an issue, and of course, very expensive. And then finally, the coordination, the complementary nature of the information that you manage, the relevancy of the information, the mechanisms by which you translate that information properly and communicate it properly, they decrease the overall risk for the project. This is of unbelievable importance to owners, to contractors, CMs at risk, other players in the game, because they realize that litigation, design defect litigation, other types of litigation can wipe out their profit. They realize they want better information, and they're willing to pay more. This is the crucial thing. They are willing to pay more. If you get to the right person to have the exchange with, they will pay you more. It's sort of like weird antiquities or something, right? Auntie left you this weird little thing, and Joey down the block will pay you $4. But if you get to the right person, they'll pay you $40,000 for it. But if you don't know how to get to that person, or don't imagine that such a person exists, it's hard to get the $40,000. So, value for whom? Clearly, specifiers need to define their value in relationship to the owner, especially if they're licensed professionals. Right? Once you start to do that, then you have to think about a different business relationship. to ultimately make good on recognizing that somebody else will really pay you significantly more for the value that you bring to the table. And that's going to be the owner. And that's going to be a relationship in which specifiers create new types of business entities which have direct relationships with an owner. And this can be worked out. This is not as hard as people imagine. I've talked to many specifiers. I've talked to a lot of insurance entities, a lot of different players to try to think this out. And it's not as difficult as it seems. It just seems difficult because nobody's ever suggested this is even a possibility. But this is just a different business entity.
Ujjwal, I want to ask David a question, actually. David, do you have many clients where you work for the owner and then the owner tells the architectural firm to use Conspectus?
We've had several. We had a couple of national brand type owners that were building all over the country, and yes, we've worked directly for them, and they dictated that the architects would use us to produce the specifications. So it's not out of the question.
How did you market to them?
To the owner?
Yes.
Actually, the ones that we marketed to, well, the ones that we worked with, we had started by working on their projects through the architect, and ended up working directly for the owner then.
Good.
And Louis, I'm not suggesting that this is something that is already existent. This is what has to happen for a certain series of reasons. I'm going to go into that for a minute, but what we're really getting to is the beginning of unleashing the proper exchange of value with the right person to pay for it.
Right, but what I was trying to communicate to our audience, many of whom are specifiers in independent practice, is that this is not a pie-in-the-sky thing. This is something that can be pursued.
Yeah, and it is not a pie-in-the-sky thing at all. It's just something that hasn't been pursued, and one of the things I've spent the last year wrestling with is, I'll tell you two things. First, when I had my initial conversation with the owner's task team, I spoke, for example, one of the people on the task team is very, very, very high up at Jones Lang LaSalle. And he happens to be a friend of mine, and I said, would you be willing to sit on this committee? He said, well, that's fine. I'd be happy to help in any way that I could. But he said, I don't know what specifiers are. This is at Jones Lang LaSalle, and you know how many square feet they manage around the world, right? One of the things is, if, just as I said with this, this antiquity, if the people who really want to buy what you have don't know that you exist, it's very hard to make this happen. So part of the task that we've suggested is, how do you market to them? How do you start talking their language? And how do you find the right business relationship by which you could actually proceed to do that? And I mean here something slightly different than, nothing wrong with this, because I'm a one-man shop as a consultant as well, but that a one-person independent specifier isn't exactly what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a business entity who is ready to have the contractual relationship with an owner, although a single-person shops can actually do this as well. They can acquire the right insurance and so forth to do it. And that's partly what we've been working on, is how do you put together the right business pieces to make this happen? Because even if you know that there's somebody who values what you want, but they live in Timbuktu and you're never going to go to Timbuktu, it won't matter. So we've got to bring those two things together. And part of our task, I think, is certainly what I like the idea. This is why I'm very positive. I really think that we have to have the model, which is the medical model, which is the architect is the GP, and the specifier is, the radiologist or the surgeon or whatever you want to talk about. And those relationships don't flow through the GP.
Proctologist.
Yeah, proctologist. Yeah, well, I'm sure that there are plenty of them that make plenty of money. So I'm just talking about the future model.
No, we just wanted to make no, you misunderstood me. It's just that we want things to come out all right in the end.
Oh, absolutely. Well, yeah, that's a good way to phrase it. It's a nice turn of phrase, actually. But whether it's the proctologist, which it's something that people think of as you don't want to do but has to be done, right? Or it's the plastic surgeon who really knows how to do this. Those are very different than the GP, who's making sort of, there's a role for the GP. There's no question about that. but more and more in my mind, the owner, and here I think of the owner as the patient, right? So the patient comes to you and says, I have a problem which requires a building. The patient comes to the doctor and says, I've got a problem that might require a pacemaker. You've got to figure out how to make that happen, and you've got to get to the right specialist to make sure it gets done correctly. So the incentives get aligned with the owner.
We do have a question from the floor from Vivian Volz, who is an independent specifier with an architectural license, and her practice assumes that the architect includes her specs in their services, so the architect essentially signs the specs that they write for them. And in fact, they're issued under his seal. Engineers typically write their own. If I work for the owner, not the architect, what contractual or licensing changes would be needed to happen to take that change into account? Would I need to seal my specs, for example?
Well, you may or you may not. Let me just go through that with you just for a second, Vivian, and I know there are a lot of people on this call who are very, very accomplished, so delighted that they're participating so actively. Basically, when you say to the architect who you're working for, you're going to sign it and it's your seal, the problem is that many specifiers come to believe that they've transferred their risk to the architect. They haven't. It's impossible for you, if you're doing the specifications, to fully transfer the risk, because in many states you have anti-indemnification statutes. And anti-indemnification statutes mean that you cannot transfer risk for negligent behavior onto another party. So depending on which state you're in and so forth, I had this conversation with a lot of specifiers who are under the impression that they can write a letter saying, hey, look, you're going to stamp it and therefore I don't have any risk, and so I don't need any insurance. But in fact, they do. Right? So that's one thing. You have to worry about that. The second thing then is, let's say you're directly in a relationship with the owner. Well, what this means is whether you stamp the drawings or not is not as important. You can have the seal, depending on, by statute, it may be the seal has to be the architect's seal, and you're not the architect of record. Or you may get the capacity to seal separately, depending on the statutory or the legislative schemes that are involved. But the key part is that you have the proper insurance scheme by which you can do this. And that's relatively easy to acquire. Right? So the owner needs to know that you're insured properly to do the work, and I think David can address this, and lots of other people can address this who are professionals, construction professionals in various ways, who are licensed and also not licensed. They can get the insurance. And the owner knows you're insured. You know that you can provide the services to him, and contractually you can find other ways to do this in terms of the relationship to the architect. So you can carve out different scopes as necessary. If you want to be a specifier who says, look, I don't want to seal anything, right? Sealing is not the crucial indicia that you have engaged in design practice. And the legal liability flows from you having engaged in design practice. I know this is, I should probably have a whole separate talk about this, and Vivian, I'm happy to talk to you offline about this if you have further interest in this. But I can tell you for the people on this call, and I've noticed this in the past, is that you have to be very careful because the legal issues can be overcome, but they are more complicated than most people think. And so it has to be kept very, very clean as to what's taking place.
Just a couple of quick comments.
Sure.
Kevin O'Byrne observes that in this presentation, a distinction seems to be made to separate specifying from the practice of architecture or engineering, but because it's all one set of construction documents, isn't it all the practice of architecture or engineering, and based on how those professions are defined in most states' professional licensing laws?
It can be, but let's be clear about this, which is the state gives a monopoly to architects for a particular reason. It gives a monopoly to engineers for a different kind of reason. Many specifiers are already licensed architects. You can be a specifier without being a licensed architect, and you can get insurance for the kind of practice that you engage in which is not required under legislative code as some kind of monopoly or some kind of fee or some kind of activity in that regard. The same kind of thing happens with building envelope specialists, right? If you, for example, if you hire somebody who's going to design your curtain wall for you, and that person may not have to be a licensed architect or even a licensed engineer. They just may be a specialist in curtain walls. This happens, relatively commonly, and there are relatively straightforward contractual ways to wrestle with this, as long as they have the correct insurance scheme in place. If you don't have the correct insurance scheme in place, you can't pull this off because people are then running around practicing there. Now, it may be, each state has a slight, there aren't 50 different variants, but different states have slight variations on this. And I wouldn't be able to tell you right offhand what applies in what context. What I will tell you is that many, many more complex situations than this are constantly solved in the world of construction. Let me give you just a simple example. Many people seem to think that this thing called IPD makes sense. The complexity, the overwhelming complexity of trying to pull together an IPD contract and the insurance schemes that are involved is staggering in comparison to what we're talking about here. So frankly, I'll tell you, it's almost impossible to figure out what the insurance scheme should be for an IPD scenario. There's very, very few projects that can pull it off. So I'd love, yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to cut you off, but we're almost on the hour. So if there's a conclusion that you want to come to here, you should move on.
All right. So how do we get there? Okay. So we've talked a little bit about this because of the questions. Okay. I would say one of the most important things here is the broader potential client base, which is owners. Architects remain clients. I have, contractors, owners, reps, manufacturers, and suppliers all become potential client base. It also means that you're able to act entrepreneurially to respond to the rapidly changing nature of design and construction, which is you are able to participate in innovation. So here's the last slide. It's a straightforward one. So you have to take the risk now or others are going to take over your role. And I'm very optimistic. The conversation we've just had on this webinar gives me a lot of confidence that we have sophisticated people who can understand how to acquire the right kind of exchange with the right people. And again, it just has to begin with thinking owners and other parties. So thanks very much. This has been very, very interesting, and I'm happy to answer as many questions or as long as people want to stay.
One of the key concepts in lean architecture, lean construction, lean design, whatever, is tracking the value stream. And that if you're not doing something that doesn't add to the value of the endeavor, the project, the outcome, you shouldn't be doing it. And one of the things that our folks who are specifiers within firms need to think about is differentiating themselves and getting in early on the projects, because people aren't going to ask you to do that. So you need to be aggressive and show them that you can add value at the schematic design and picking the right kind of roof, which may affect the structural design of the steel that supports the roof.
No, I completely agree with you, Lois. The difficulty, of course, is I think many of the people on this call will also attest to that, is that there's only so many times you can go hit your head against the wall. And so, there are lots of people who are passionate. I mean, I think this is one of the most interesting and important parts about specifiers, is that they're quite passionate about what they do because they like solving the problem. They like doing it correctly. And they like, doing it. The competency is always of high value. The dilemma is, as we've known, what happens when the kid who just graduated from Princeton 3 years ago has higher prestige value than you do after 25 years of practice. And that's because design holds a different prestige scenario with firms. But I agree with you to the degree that you can force yourself further up the stream. That's crucial. And I do want to say a quick thing about lean that you just mentioned. Lean, of course, comes from the history of factories and Toyota. and its application to the construction industry has been attempted, and there are some very interesting outcomes to it, especially the pull scheduling is very, very important. But I think its application to something like architecture design specifications is a little bit vaporous, except for what you just suggested, which is that you want to do stuff that only adds value. You want to get rid of all that other stuff. Now, if you're going to apply that to something like design, this becomes very potent. I mean, and I would argue this very strongly. I've argued it in other places, but this is one of the reasons the AIA has never been able to provide a coherent statement for how design adds value. I mean, and I think what we're talking about is that specifiers can.
Yes.
Right? They can. The value is they reduce overall risk. They reduce the time delay. They reduce the overall cost to the owner. Can design do any of that? No. Generally, it can't tell you we're going to decrease the cost to the owner. In fact, we don't even know what the cost is. We'll have to redesign halfway through anyway. Then, in terms of time, well, we don't really know. That's all means and methods. Somebody else does that. How do we know how long it's really going to take and how it's going to be done?
Well, we need to wrap up, Ujjwal. Thank you very much for giving this presentation. If most of you probably already know, was a form of this was given at the CSI Academies last month, and Ujjwal was the speaker there. And we will be listing his contact information for people who want to follow up with specific questions when the thing is posted. And I am all agog. I am truly excited to find out what David is going to speak on next month.
Oh, really? We're going to have to talk, Louis. That's all I can say. We're going to have to talk. And I'm trying to find out when is the meeting next month. We're right up against May Day. The very first day in May. May 1, 3 o'clock, same time, same channel. So we'll see everyone then.
And if you have suggestions for what you'd like us to discuss, keep those cards and letters coming in, friends and neighbors.
Yes, we appreciate your comments. All right, thanks everybody for attending. I really appreciate the time. Take care.
Thank you, Ujjwal.
Bye-bye.